This is Elizabeth Creamer. I'm coming to you from my home office in Blacksburg, Virginia, and I'm here at the invitation of your professor, Dr. Peggy Shannon Baker, who asked me to do a narrated overview of an article I wrote with Michelle Ghoston called Using Mixed Methods to Analyze Mission Statements from Colleges of Engineering. This article is a 2012 article in the Journal of Mixed Methods, and it marks sort of a transition for me when I really moved from an emphasis on my content area, which for probably maybe 25 years, maybe 30 years, focused on issues of gender and women's recruitment and enrollment in science, technology, and engineering, both as students and faculty, to a more methodological orientation, which ultimately led to write a book. So here, this came out of a large project that I'll tell you about in a little bit, and reflects that content area expertise that really characterized most of my career until maybe the last 5 years. So what I want to talk about in this YouTube, let me see if I can move, whoops, is I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to MMMR. I want to describe some of the key features of my textbook, and I want to give an overview of this article from the Journal of Mixed Methods Research. Talked how I use a type of mixing that is referred to as data transformation, and more in a little bit about the opportunity that I always regret that I didn't take with this article, the next steps I might have taken with the analysis that I can see now but couldn't see then. So when we talk a little bit about me, let me move this picture. I want to say first that I'm a social scientist, a behavioral science. I worked my entire career in educational research. I have, unlike many of the people who have written before me, very strong qualitative leanings. I taught, my teaching load was balanced over the last 15 years between mixed methods and qualitative research. I'm particularly interested in grounded theory, but you don't see that in this article. I started teaching mixed methods in qualitative research really in the late 1990s when books were first starting to come out about mixed methods. I had been involved in an interdisciplinary center and that really have natural inclinations to cross boundaries, I would say. Like your professor, Dr. Shannon Baker, I am very active in the Mixed Method International Research Association, which I find to be a super welcoming group. I'm on the board and actually the incoming president of this, assuming that presidency in August. The picture here shows me in Japan. They haven't translated my book yet into Japanese, but here I am with some sage representatives at a conference, a mixed method conference held by an affiliate in Osaka, Japan. This is last August. So I am still a little bit surprised, but I am managed to, over the course of 4 years, translate my course materials into a book that's called An Introduction to Fully Integrated Mixed Methods Research, that just came out last April and was produced by the top premier publisher of methodology books, Sage Press. I think what distinguishes this book is the emphasis on integration, the challenging, they're trying to push forward the idea of integration, which I think really has been assumed by the foundational voices to be something that occurs during interpretation, during the interpretation phase. And I really try to conceptualize ways that integration between qualitative and quantitative data can occur throughout the research process. The only quick article I've ever written, I'm quite a deliberative writer who loves to write anyway, but I spend a lot of time, is a brief article that I wrote literally in a matter of weeks right after I had sent the textbook off to the publisher. And this is a sort of a nice summary, I think, of the entire book. I think the key statement that really distinguishes that article is the idea that when you pick the mixed methods label and you assign it to a publication or a piece of research, you're really doing that to communicate to an audience that the idea of mixing the two sources of data is really central to your purposes and to understanding the conclusions. It's not simply about multiple sources of data, but it's about engaging those sources of data in dialectical and energetic ways. You've probably heard already by this time in the semester that every mixed method researcher puts their own little tweak on a definition of mixed methods research. I consider that a positive sign, not a negative sign, because I think it means there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm among a core group of people that have consistently been writing about mixed methods for 20, 25 years. I am a relative newcomer to some of the people who started writing and publishing about it in the early 90s. Central to my definition is an interest in the intention to engage multiple perspectives. Again, that sort of energetic exchange between qualitative and quantitative data sources. I feel much affinity with Jennifer Green, who describes this as a mixed method way of thinking. So it's not pursuing different sources of data simply for confirmation, but I think the real strength of it is leveraging different sources of data to produce more complex and nuanced explanations. So I really think the confirmatory role is, to me, one of the less creative uses of mixed methods, if I could get a little radical. Let me talk a little bit about some of the features that distinguish my textbook, and I do this in part because I think it also frames the article. The textbook is meant to be introductory. It is, I believe, the first, other than Green, that has a very strong qualitative orientation. This is quite different than the Tedley Tashikori textbook, for example. I do not place as much emphasis on a core set of designs as has been presented in most of the foundational literature. In fact, I moved away from them as I engaged with 9 different exemplars that really I could not shoehorn into these core sets of designs. So the articles that I found to be creative uses of different mixing strategies, different purposes, just did not fit neatly in the core designs. I've mentioned already that I really feel that the way to shift the thinking forward now is to be more comprehensive and holistic in the ways we think about mixing, and that we imagine that mixing can occur at many phases. I have a little artistic bent, not to say I am artistic, but maybe I am a little creative, and I use the metaphor of the architectural arch to stand for mixed methods. To me, this is a wonderful metaphor. I see it everywhere I travel. This is a picture I took in Lyon, France. And initially, I conceived this as one arm of the arch being the qualitative, another arm being the quantitative. And the thing that drops in at the end, traditionally it's viewed at the end, is a meta-inference that links or integrates those two. The meta-inference can also come from analysis. So the keystone is that last piece that drops in, which I think is a nice metaphor for a meta-inference. So I mentioned this idea that is captured by my title of Fully Integrated Mixed Methods Research, which really tries to envision opportunities for mixing at all phases. At the design phase, in the research and purpose statement, in the research question and purpose statements, during data collection, sometimes through coding, sometimes through different strategies that integrate qual and quant during coding. Very big emphasis on integration during analysis, and then the traditional focus, which is how some people link qual and qual conclusions, still keeping them relatively separate during the integration phase. So when I think about the mission statement article, I want to say first that it is a very clear reflection of a very long-standing feminist agenda. I became a faculty member in the 1980s, and it was the experience itself led me to feminism, to understand the experience in the social system that was around in the 80s. Particularly for faculty women and administrators. So I am a feminist. My research implicitly reflects a feminist agenda, and certainly the mission statement article does as well. It was the tail end of a very large, almost 10-year project funded through several National Science Foundation grants to try to understand the role that institutional culture played in the recruitment and retention of women at the undergraduate level in engineering. And I put the engine there because I will put a little punchline to that study, which I'll tell you a little bit later. But I came to think that after many site visits that were done as part of that study, that a key clue to culture in different colleges of engineering were the visualizations one would see in the lobby. This also translates to the mission statements as sort of formal articulations of values. I think what hangs in the lobby communicates values. And when I walk in the lobby of a college of engineering and I see that it is dominated by engines, different kinds of engines, if I could be a little cynical here, it first of all tells me that it's a little bit old-fashioned, and I would be able to predict that the enrollment of women would be relatively low in those kinds of institutions. So my main sort of takeaway lesson from this large funded study is a distinctly qualitative one, distinctly ethnographic one. So when you look into mission statements, why would you use mission statements? Well, I think they are a wonderful source of data. I'm a big believer that there's a lot of data out there, particularly on the internet, that is easily, readily, and freely extracted, and that is much more viable than what is increasingly difficult ways of collecting data, but traditional ones of interviews and focus groups. So mission statements for departments, for colleges, for universities are public statements. They're readily available online. They're readily extractable and importable into qualitative software such as NVivo and MaxQDA and Deduce. And mission statements are really a formal, public, visible statement of the avowed goals, purposes, and values of a unit. They probably, although you could argue this chicken and egg, they do play some role in recruiting both of faculty, students, and administrators. I say chicken and egg because you never know whether the mission statement drives the culture, if the culture drives the mission statement, but more readily, it's probably an interaction of the two. So another advantage of mission statements is they tend to be concise. Here's one from Cal Poly Pomona in Southern California, one of the campuses we happened to visit. And here is an example of a mission statement and a vision statement that recognize diversity. In this case, they have a brief mission statement that gets to polytechnic philosophy, collaboration, teamwork, creativity, lifelong learning, values. And down here, part of their vision is an international, which is a type of diversity. And down here, they repeat that emphasis by talking about diverse student populations. So in this case, they're making clear that by diversity, they're including and meaning international students. So what brought me to MMRI, mixed method research, in this article that ultimately led to this article? I mentioned that for more than 10 years, a group of us had funding from NSF to try to understand differences in culture that might influence particularly the retention of women. There's a high and long-standing loss of women, even in institutions that are successful in recruiting women, which can be relatively low, down around 10% or less than 10% of the undergraduate student body, and in some places can go as high as 60%. So there's a huge difference across colleges of engineering in the number of women and the proportion of women enrolled, and that has mostly to do with their curriculum. So culture is related to curriculum. NSF publishes demographic data about these institutions, so it was easy for us to extract information about the representation of women, the number and proportion of women. In the first place, you see that in a mixed method sort of mindset is we use that quantitative data to pick a stratified sample of institutions across the country, matching a high above average enrollment with a low, and then moving across the entire country to get at those cultural differences. We collected both quant and qual data. The qual data was a subset of the quant data. So we surveyed students at institutions, and we did site visits at 9 different institutions across the United States, where a team of us did observations. We interviewed students, we interviewed faculty, we interviewed administrators, and we took extensive field notes and eventually developed case studies. For analyzing the mission statement, Michelle Ghostin carried the majority of the weight. We analyzed 48 mission statements in this stratified sample, and we used an open coding approach. We could have used a combination of deductive and inductive, but we used a pure inductive approach and inductively coded those mission statements. We then compared the inductive codes to what could have been a deductive code, which are the values and goals endorsed by ABET, the accrediting agency for colleges of engineering. We would have lost out, however, if we had used the ABET values or goals as our coding scheme, because it turned out that those were not what was emphasized in the mission statements. Usually there were 2 or fewer of those. One of the ways we mixed after the open coding was by both quantifying and quantitizing the qualitative data that we had coded. This is referred to as data transformation in mixed methods research. And it's a type of mixing at one point. So data transformation includes two words with lots of syllables, quantitizing and qualitizing. It's either converting qualitative data into quantitative data, or much more rarely, qualitative data into quantitative data. And those are both sort of exciting developments. So data transformation, the counting that begins with counting of qualitative data, was really some of the first ways that it was imagined that mixing could occur in mixed methods research, and certainly it was the first way that I got engaged in mixing during analysis. So there's a difference, a subtle difference, but an important difference between quantifying and quantitizing. You often see quantifying in qualitative research when a researcher counts the occurrences of themes, maybe even when a researcher sorts occurrences of themes. But simple counting of themes in qualitative data is not quantitizing, which requires us moving to statistical procedures, and that is not mixed methods. So simply counting the themes in qualitative data is counting. It's not mixing qualitative and quantitative data. So the sort of punchline in our study and where the mixing occurred lays in this table, which I label explicitly as a mixing table, where we took the inductively derived codes here and we tested their relationship to the proportion of male grads and the number and proportion of female grads. Remembering we're trying to get at the question, is there a difference in the values endorsed in institutions that have a higher representation of women than have a lower representation of women? Well, you can see a few values other than the ones I highlighted that are moderately strong. These are correlations between the number of female grads and these qualitative codes. So you see one here in Impact Global, which is actually, I think, a very telling conclusion. And then the strongest and most consistent link here is between the diversity code. So items that we coded to reflect diversity had the strongest connections, reinforcing some connection between mission statements and the representation of women. The Impact Global between number of female grads and this particular qualitative goal to have a global impact is important because it really touches on this idea of how important it is increasingly, and especially for women, to understand the social and practical implications of engineering applications. And this is not a new finding for research about women in engineering, but a very strong one that crosses the literature. This is very, very important to the recruitment and retention of women. I talk about this project as the Lost Opportunity Project, in that I see now, or I saw later, I could have gone on one more step, because many, in cases of institutions that mention the diversity code, it really turned out that they were talking about diversity in several different ways. And then in some institutions, and this is from Iowa, the diversity concept was really mirrored in several ways. They weren't just talking about gender diversity or ethnic or racial diversity or international diversity. Sometimes they were talking about diversity of ideas and embracing diverse ways of thinking and diverse worldviews. So intensity coding would allow us to multiple code institutions. We could have had a measure that reflected institutions with a very unusually high number of codes related to diversity from institutions that simply mentioned it once. So this would have been a next step that could have built on the finding that the intensity code did distinguish institutions with high and low representation of women. So it's sort of a lost opportunity that I still feel like, oh, why didn't I do that? This is an example. I use the example of the mission statement article in the chapter in my textbook that is about data transformation and strategies for mixing data. So let me wrap up by telling you a little bit more about resources that I have been putting on the internet, thanks in part to inspiration by colleagues like Dr. Shannon Baker. I have a web page that I post sort of social media things from social media that intrigue me, that I think are inherently mixed methods. And I'm also been posting different YouTubes that summarize key points of the chapters in my book. So far, I think I've done 3 of these, including the ones that I've listed here for Chapter 1, Chapter 2, and Chapter 3, which is about paradigms. So I hope this has given you a little summary, not only of the article and some background of the article, what brought me to write it, how things sort of moved on for me after that article, and how I became increasingly interested in writing involving the methodology of mixed methods, which is pretty much all that I've been writing on since, I'd say maybe 2014. I have really become primarily a methodologist, and my infatuation is really with mixed methods.